Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video as we continue on with Extra History's Kursk. Yesterday we looked at part one of this four-part series, which talked a lot about the beginning stages of the war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, talking about the Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union in the early 1940s by Nazi Germany. Now we're going to get into part two, and we're going to continue the conversation as we work our way toward what became the largest tank battle in the history of the world at Kursk. So I haven't watched this yet. I don't know what it's all about. And as I mentioned yesterday, the Eastern Front is not something I know nearly enough about. So I'm seeing this as an opportunity to learn, as well as maybe share some insights here and there about topics that I do know something about. So let's continue the conversation. Use the comment section below if you have something to add, if you have questions, if you have observations that you want to make. Don't forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And we're going to be announcing some more streams pretty soon. I'm going to do another history meme stream, as well as some other things. Thank you to all of you who made suggestions about merch. You should see the first merch showing up on the channel in the next day or two. It takes a couple of days for the store to sync to the YouTube channel, but that is happening. So let's go ahead and dive into part two of Kursk.
Today, I'd like to kick this off by doing something we rarely get to do. You see, wargaming employs a fellow named Richard Cutland, aka the Challenger. He's an ex-British tankie who served 30 years, both in peace and during war, and now he's a military specialist for wargaming. And we figured, why not invite him on to talk about how tanks evolved from the beginning of Barbarossa to the Battle of Kursk, to discuss the types of tanks and the mechanized weaponry present there, to give us a picture of how the German and Soviet tanks fared against one another, and to discuss the effects of winter and weather on armored combat of the day. So, Richard Cutland, why don't you set the scene for us?
My pleasure. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans weren't expecting much from their opponents' tank forces, which were mostly composed of old T-26 and BTs. But little did they know the most advanced Soviet tank models, the brand new KV-1 and T-34, were actually superior to all German tanks. The German standard anti-tank weapons were found to be ineffective against these new Soviet vehicles. Still, these tanks were not available in great numbers. Their deployment was still incomplete when Barbarossa commenced. By 1941, the Red Army had deployed 1,000 T-34s and over 500 KV tanks.
So that's interesting, because I think by the end of the war, they built something like, 60 or 80,000 of these T-34s. I mean, it was an insane number of T-34s, but they also lost a lot. I think they lost 30 or 40,000 of them. So it wasn't like it was impervious to being destroyed. Because they built a lot of them, but they also lost a lot of them. And what had happened was both sides, Germany and the Soviet Union, had gotten involved in different ways in the Spanish Civil War in the years leading up to World War II. And this gave them a great opportunity to test some of their new equipment. Because you know what? Planning is great. But until you actually get into combat situations, you really don't think of everything. And what happens is you get into combat, you start facing enemy technology that you didn't know about or you hadn't planned for, and you start to learn what your weaknesses and your strengths are, and then you adapt. And whoever adapts better and is able to upgrade and produce new equipment and get it to the field and get people trained on it is going to get the advantage.
Concentrated in only 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. Plus, the Soviet numerical advantage in heavy equipment was thoroughly offset by the superior training and organization of the Wehrmacht.
And we talked about that already in the Western Front against France, where Germany didn't have the numbers that France did, but they had superior tactics, superior skill, superior manpower in terms of having the key people in the right places and knowing what they were doing. They didn't have the numbers, but you can offset superior numbers if you can outwit them, if you can maneuver them on the battlefield. And that's what Germany was really, really good at.
Soviet tank units were rarely well equipped. They lacked training and logistical support. Units were sent into combat with no arrangements in place for refueling, ammunition, resupply, or personal replacement. Often, after a single engagement, units were destroyed or rendered ineffective. But on the German side, their few encounters with the powerful Soviet KV-1s and T-34s raised clear warning signs. They sent a special panzer commission to the Eastern Front on the 20th of November 1941 to study and learn from the superior Russian T-34s.
So this was wise because even though there were small numbers of T-34s, they understood how powerful these could be on the battlefield in large numbers. And you had to figure it's only a matter of time before the Soviets are able to get large numbers of them to the front. So it was wise of the Germans to immediately say, okay, what can we learn from this and how can we counter it and how can we get them to the battlefield in time?
The Germans now realised the advantage of sloped armour, which either deflected or reduced the impact of armoured-piercing shells. They introduced longer guns for the Panzer IV and added side skirts to protect the vehicles from anti-tank rifles. By the summer of 1943, right in time for the Battle of Kursk, the Wehrmacht was being equipped with the fruits of this research. The Tiger and Panther tanks were introduced, as was the new Ferdinand tank destroyer. Hitler focused heavily on these new designs, which he believed were the key to victory, and matched them with an increase in manpower. By the summer of 1943, 2/3 of the German army were based in Russia. That belief paid early dividends. When the Panther tank first appeared on the battlefields of the Eastern Front, the Soviets did not have an effective weapon to counter it. During the Battle of Kursk, it demonstrated that it could destroy any Soviet armoured fighting vehicle from long distance. As a result, it had a very high overall kill ratio, despite making up less than 7% of the estimated 2,400 to 2,700 total armoured fighting vehicles.
So imagine if the Germans could have gotten larger numbers of Panthers to the front and time to really make a difference. Because if you got one Panther taking on multiple Soviet tanks and being able to win that, imagine what you could do with a couple thousand of them. But they just didn't have the resources to be able to do that.
Deployed by the Germans in this battle. But at the same time, it had been rushed to the field unready. Many units failed due to mechanical problems, and the Panther alone could not punch through the Soviets' layered defence system at Kursk. Even heavier tank designs like the Tiger were not a total win for Nazi Germany. While superior engineering-wise, they weren't easy to manufacture, which made them not suitable for wartime economics. You see, heavy tanks aren't that hard to make. You just add more of everything. But they're expensive, and they're hard to maintain, and they bog down. So they're only useful in certain situations. Indeed, the Soviets also had tanks comparable to the Tiger, the IS-2, plenty used, and they were also similar, big, deadly, and not really worth it. On the Soviet side, their research had focused on a new medium tank, called the T-43. But it had been commissioned back in 1942 to counter the Panzer IV, and it did not have enough firepower or armour protection to go up against Germany's new Panther. Many within the Soviet High Command believed the war effort would be better served by simply making more of the same T-34s that they had introduced at the start of the war. T-34s had the advantage of being faster and more nimble than the larger German tanks. The Soviets used them to their advantage by massing tanks and running them at full speed against German positions. The Germans could destroy a Soviet tank before the Soviet tank could get into range, about 2 kilometres versus 1 kilometre. So in the end, the tanks of both countries wound up being pretty comparable. No one nation had clearly superior tank technology. What the Soviet Union did have, however, was a clearly superior industrial force. They outproduced the Germans. Yep. So the biggest difference by far between Soviet and German tanks is that more of the former existed. Their home terrain also gave the Soviets an advantage. The Kursk region was famous for its black earth, which produced considerable dust when dry. These huge dust clouds would cut off the powerful German air support from the battlefield, and since the Soviet defenders were stationary, they were able to set up better observation points to scout and target their enemies. Even when it rained, huge thunderstorms turned the ground into a muddy quagmire that halted the German offensive where speed was essential. The home ground advantage combined with preparation time had clearly played in the favour of the defenders. Now I'll kick it back to Dan, but first I want to say a huge thank you to the Extra History team. It's been an absolute privilege to work with you and to be part of this animated journey through history.
And so I would say, nothing really to add to what he said. Obviously, he's an expert in his field and he knows what he's talking about. But this is what's great about this is working with other people is that you can bring in somebody like that who has the knowledge that maybe you don't have. And that's why I constantly acknowledge up front when there's an area that I know a lot about versus where I don't know a lot about. We're all here to learn. Nobody, even somebody like myself who has spent most of their life studying history, who has gone to college for that, who has read hundreds of books on various topics, can't possibly in a lifetime know everything. And so it's great to be able to pool our collective knowledge and learn. And so for me, even though I'm the one making the channel, I continue to see this as an opportunity for me to learn from all of you, to learn from these videos, and we all come away a little richer in our knowledge that way.
To all the viewers, I wish you well, and hope you find this series both entertaining and informative. And a final comment from the Royal Tank Regiment's motto, fear naught.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, now that we're a little more familiar with the hardware involved, let's round this episode out with a little more of the run-up to what would so famously be known as the Battle of Kursk. Last we left off, German forces had been pushed back from Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht 6th Army had been surrounded and destroyed, and the Soviets had taken the offensive. But reeling from this defeat, Hitler finally gave full operational control to his general in charge of Army Group South, Erich von Manstein.
So let's talk about Manstein for a second, and I think it is Stein. Somebody can help me with this.
Operational control to his general in charge of Army Group South, Erich von Manstein.
My German friends help me with this. Typically, when you have EI, it's pronounced with the I. And when it's IE, it's pronounced. I think whatever letter second is how it's pronounced. So I think it's Manstein. But if I'm wrong, let me know. So let's talk about Manstein a little bit. This is something I do know something about. This is a guy who, first of all, Manstein's not even his birth name. His birth name was actually Lewinsky. He was born into this incredibly huge Prussian family. He was like the 10th son of his parents. And so he was actually given up for adoption to another family member, the Mansteins, who I think were an aunt and uncle who adopted him and raised him as their own because there were already so many sons in the family. And almost everybody in his family was in the military. His biological father, I think, was a lieutenant general in the Prussian military. His uncle was Paul von Hindenburg, who was not only the one of the prominent generals of World War I, but also was the president of Germany when Hitler became chancellor. So there's a lot of history here for Manstein. His teenage son, died on the Eastern Front fighting against the Soviets, and so this is very personal to him. He wants to get this right. I think after the war, he was convicted of war crimes. And I think he was sentenced to more than a decade in prison, but only did like 4 or 5 years. And then actually became an advisor to the West German military in the 1950s. He was one of the most prominent people in defending the Wehrmacht against charges that they were involved in the final solution and in the crimes against humanity, even though it came out that Wehrmacht soldiers definitely were involved in some of those things. He was arguing strongly in the idea that the Wehrmacht was not involved in anything that Hitler was doing that was separate, but obviously that was not necessarily always the case.
Manstein decided to trade territory for time and accept retreat on a scale Hitler never would have the year before. His plan was to lure the Soviets forward until there was a time and place where he could pounce on an overextended Soviet line. He found that opportunity at Kharkov. As the Soviets pushed forward past the city, Manstein's reorganized and reinforced panzer divisions fell on their flanks. They rapidly encircled and cut off pockets of the Red Army. Soon the city of Kharkov was back in their hands. The Soviet losses were nothing like they were at the outset of the war, but losing 85,000 soldiers in a matter of weeks at the cost of a mere 10,000 German casualties seemed like it might signal the possibility of the initiative falling back into German hands. But 85,000 on a front of nearly 2 million men wasn't enough to change the flow of the war.
And isn't that incredible? Think about that, 85,000 losses, and you're like, it really doesn't change things all that much for us as the Soviets. That's what happens when you have massive amounts of manpower like the Soviet army did.
The Soviets didn't lose their nerve or pull back after these losses. They were on a grim march forward to Berlin. Something else, something much more drastic would have to be done to put Germany back on the offensive. But as the battle lines evened out after the rapid German assault, everyone noticed one thing. There was a 100-mile-long and 160-mile-deep salient, or...
And honestly, if you look at the history of World War II, the fights in Europe, this is a repeated scenario. A bulge in the line that needs to be dealt with, needs to be cut off. This was constantly the Germans' desire in terms of how they fought. When they invaded Poland, it was all about cutting them off and encircling and destroying. It's what they did when they invaded France. Cut them off, encircle them, destroy. That pincer movement. And so now here we go again. You've got the Soviets got this huge salient at Kursk, and the Germans are going to try to cut it off and destroy, which is what you have to do when you're vastly outnumbered. You have to encircle and destroy large numbers to try and even the odds. You can't just go, toe to toe and have, just battering each other in the front lines. It won't work when you're outnumbered 4, 5, 6 to 1 in some places.
Or bulge in the Russian lines around the town of Kursk. Cutting off this salient would strengthen the German position, deal a real blow to the Soviet army in the south, and if it could be done swiftly and decisively, return the initiative to the German forces. An attack on the Kursk salient was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. So join us next time for Operation Citadel, when the battle for Kursk begins.
Yeah, so we've got 2 episodes still to go in this series, so we'll definitely be diving into Citadel. We'll be talking about the Battle of Kursk itself, which is a really fascinating strategy by the Soviets, where they actually were planning an offensive, but then got intelligence that the Germans were planning an offensive, and so they actually played into the German hands by allowing them to attack and then counterattacking. So it's really a brilliant move. It's one of the better strategies the Soviets had during the course of the war. So let me know your thoughts about all of that. What can you add to what I've said? What did maybe I overlook that I should have talked about? Use the comment section below. We'll be back tomorrow with part 3. And also make sure that you have the notification bell turned on and turn on all notifications. That way when I post about upcoming streams and things that we're scheduling that'll be coming in the next few days, that way you won't miss those things. Plus, we'll also be posting our announcement about the winners of the biographies that I'll be giving out here in a couple of days. Couple of days, hopefully, if we hit 50,000 subscribers. The link is in the description below, and when we hit 50,000 subscribers, I'll be giving those out. So make sure you're subscribed and enter the contest. We'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.